Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Psychology from a Classroom. I'm Mrs. Sarah Ryan, and today in AP Psychology we are continuing to look at Unit 7, which is cognition, and more specifically talking about memory. So in our past couple of lessons, we talked about encoding, which is getting information into our brains, and we talked about some strategies to make that more efficient. We talked about storage with our long-term and our short-term memory. And today we're talking about retrieval, which is getting that information out and what likely is happening when it comes to memory and being able to get information out. So first of all, it's really important to understand that your memory and what it is that you are able to recall or to pull information out of your mind is likely not exactly how things actually went down. So we often think that memory is like a video recording, and that we record the events that happen in our lives and that they just get laid out exactly as they took place. And so then years later, when we are recalling how these events occurred, we think that we have like this very clear image of what happened and can easily recall these different events. What's actually happening, however, is that when you are recalling information from your mind, you are missing pieces, okay? That there's plenty of little pieces that go missing along the way, that never got stored in the first place, or perhaps have changed, and they have changed because of other events that took place, or they have changed because new information came out, and so you are misremembering things, not exactly as they happened, but simply as you remember them. And so it's really important to respect the fact that our memories, as precious as they are to us, and what it is that we think of ourselves and what our memories are, that they are not foolproof. And this is something that we sometimes have a little hard time coming to terms with, because we rely so much on our memories and who we are and what our experiences have been, that to say that they could be false, that's something that just doesn't sit well with people. And that's where some really interesting research by the psychologist Elizabeth Loftus comes into play. I highly recommend reading her work or seeing her TED Talk, where she explores specifically like eyewitness testimony and the idea that we rely very heavily in our American legal system on eyewitnesses to recall events as they transpired. And she actually demonstrates using science how fragile our recall of memory truly is. So there's a couple of things to identify here between what we call recall as well as recognition. So recall is where you simply retrieve information out of the depths of your mind. So you can think of this as an example of like a fill-in-the-blank test with no word bank. That it is just straight up, here are the questions, and boom, you have to pull that information out of your brain. And that's pretty tough to do. Okay, recall is challenging. And on different kinds of memory challenges, we know that humans don't do as well on recall as we do on recognition. Recognition is simply where I need to recognize from previously learned material like what is correct or what would have happened. And so that's like a multiple choice kind of test question, where I just have to recognize which of these is the most likely going to be the correct answer, which best fits, as opposed to hooking into that information from the back of my mind and being able to pull it out and being able to retrieve it. So recall and recognition are two different concepts that if I think back about like my high school years 20 years ago and remember like who my friends were from high school, I'd probably be able to recall a handful of names of people that I was friends with. But if I busted out my yearbook, which I actually know that my senior year yearbook is in my classroom right now, if I were to pull that out and like start leafing through the pages, oh, I'd start recognizing this, and I would recognize this, and that I would actually be able to recognize more people that I knew as like being my friends. And I would also be able to hook into more pieces of my memory, because memory works as a web of association. And that as soon as I get one hook, as soon as I get one piece of information, it can lead me to the next one, and to the next one, and to the next one. And so that's actually why, like, sitting around with people who've known you for a really long time and you start reminiscing about things, that you often likely start remembering more because of things that they said, like, oh, that triggered that memory in my mind. And so that is something that's going to happen with retrieval. Now, another piece of research that was done on retrieval was done by somebody named Ebbinghaus. And this becomes known as the forgetting curve, or sometimes it's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And it looks like this. So we look at how do memories fade over time, and what is it that's actually going to become a memory. And Ebbinghaus's research on memory and what becomes known as storage decay, where the memories simply fade over time, found that immediately there's a very sharp drop off as to how much information that you were able to recall. So you can see this in my graph here, where like zoom, it goes straight down. But you'll notice then there's like this leveling effect that happens. And that's what the forgetting curve is actually demonstrating, is that while yes, initially there's a pretty sharp drop off on the amount of information that I can remember. So it's this memory retention in terms of percentage. That's what the graph is demonstrating. But as time goes on, that 20% or so of memory that I am able to maintain, I'm actually probably going to maintain it for a pretty long time. And so I go back to like my high school examples here. And one of those for me is studying French. So when it came time to pick a language, I chose to study French, and I took French classes for several years. Now, in my adult life, I really haven't had the opportunity to utilize those French skills that I learned all those years ago, which is unfortunate, but you know, it's just kind of how life goes. And so when it comes to like, well, what is it that I can recall about the French language, you know, there's certain things that just have stuck with me all of these years in, like, you know, being able to say bonjour and comment ça va, how are you, ça va bien, je m'appelle Madame Rhine. I can always remember that ham is le jambon, and that an apple is la pomme, and that a potato is le pomme de terre, because it is an apple of the earth, right? Like there's just this kind of random stuff that I seem to be able to remember, but I can't really speak French anymore like I used to be able to, or being able to understand it, because it's not something that I've been able to study. And so that forgetting curve is showing how, you know, there's this really steep drop off of how much retention that I have, but then the pieces that I do remember, you know, I can remember those for a really long period of time. And so that's what the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is going to demonstrate. I'm going to turn my lights back on. There we go. Okay. So last thing for this lesson, and if we're going to pay attention to anything, boom, here it is, because we have yet another super confusing pair in AP Psychology, and by far this is the concepts that get the most mixed up with one another, and that is the difference between proactive and retroactive interference. So proactive and retroactive interference are talking about interference in what it is that I'm capable of remembering, and that I'm having problems remembering something because another piece of information is getting in the way. And so I've failed to remember something because another piece of information has interfered. And so there's two types to this proactive and retroactive. So proactive interference is telling me that something that I learned in the past is interfering with my ability to recall something that I have recently learned. And so here in proactive interference, I remember something old, I'm having difficulty remembering something new. So this is the classic example with like your internet passwords and things like that. You can't remember, or you remember your old password, right? You remember, easy peasy, can't remember the new one, okay? Or if you have an instance where you had to change phone numbers, or at school it could be locker combinations. You remember the old one, can't remember the new one. That would be referred to as proactive interference. In proactive interference, I can remember this old piece of information and I can't remember the new piece of information. Now, retroactive interference is going to be the exact opposite of that. In retroactive interference, something that I've recently learned is preventing me from remembering something from my past. So in retroactive interference, I can remember the new information, I can't remember the old information. So that might be something, again, with like locker combinations. I remember this year's locker combination, boom, 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 got that, no big deal. Last year's locker combination, whoosh, no idea what that is. I can remember my new password for my, I don't know, Snapchat or whatever things you guys are using these days. Like, I can remember the new password, can't remember what the old one was. That would be an example of retroactive interference. So proactive and retroactive interference very frequently get confused with one another, and they are something that College Board loves to ask questions about because they are this confusing pair. So if you can remember that in proactive interference, I can remember the old information, and in retroactive interference, I can remember the new information, there may just be a mnemonic device floating around AP Psych circles for this that's not super appropriate for my video. But if you can remember those two things, then you will be golden. So until next time, thanks for joining me.